Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Everything EastEnders. So you can probably tell from the title of this episode, we're going to be looking into quite a serious subject, and there are mentions of war, conflict, genocide, terrorism, Islamophobia, violence. So if these things upset you, then please just watch one of my other videos. I'm going to be looking into whether EastEnders whitewashes and glorifies the army. I will be looking into whether the representation of the army and soldiers and characters who have been in the army challenge the idea of the army as a force for social good, or whether it kind of upholds the status quo and censors the army as something that exists to keep the peace and maintain our own civil rights and freedoms. So why am I making this video? As you may know, on October 7th, Hamas launched terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians, something which I wholeheartedly condemn. That is something that I want to make absolutely clear. In no way do I condone or support any kind of terrorist acts, whether they are committed by groups, individuals, or even governments. Because what needs to be recognized is that in response, the Israeli government has been doing what it has been carrying out since 1948 against the Palestinians, and that is genocide.
Decades-long impunity for widespread and systematic human rights violations has emboldened Israel in its recurrence and intensification of international crimes in Palestine. At the outset, South Africa acknowledges that the genocidal acts and omissions by the State of Israel inevitably form part of a continuum of illegal acts perpetrated against the Palestinian people since 1948. The application places Israel's genocidal acts and omissions within the broader context of Israel's 75-year apartheid, 56-year occupation, and 16-year siege imposed on the Gaza Strip. The State of Israel shall immediately suspend its military operations in and against Gaza.
Since the beginning of this genocidal war, reservists have been called up. And who are the reservists? They are the entire proportion of the Israeli society. There are teachers, professors, students, doctors, medics, artists, writers, journalists. These images, they are not only directed to a small audience, they are directed to a broad audience. History has taught us that the dehumanization of subjects is essential to the infliction of violence. I think Israel has perfected this in discourse and in practice, but this is not new. It dates back to the beginning of this state, through which Palestinians were expelled, degraded, humiliated, killed, and effectively, forcibly disappeared.
While South Africa has been taking Israel to court over, as I said, genocide at the International Court of Justice, our government has launched airstrikes against Yemen because Houthi rebels had stopped Israeli commercial ships, causing them financial losses. And so to protect Israeli commercial interests, the UK launched airstrikes. Most recently, our government's own lawyers have advised them that selling weapons to Israel makes them complicit in this genocide as well. Yet you'll notice that our politicians have not been very vocal on this. They haven't used the word genocide. They won't even really call for a ceasefire. Instead, they've been justifying the violence and the starvation of Palestinians by stating that Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorism.
Since the 7th of October, the first moment, Israel started preparing and putting together a huge campaign to delegitimize the Palestinian people, to link Hamas to ISIS, and then link Hamas to the Palestinian people, then link the Palestinian people to ISIS, then do the ethnic cleansing and the mass destruction and the mass murder you are following on your screen sets. Okay, that's exactly what happened. Then the international media, mainstream media, were literally following the cues. ISIS. You talked about Iraq all the time. ISIS is a group of criminals who gathered from all over, mercenaries who were there to kill and only to kill with no real agenda. You agree?
Yes.
You think Palestinians are that?
No.
Don't you think we have a political and legal case to make?
But I think
so why are we using these terms?
Ambassador,
we are using these terms to allow the Israeli war machine to kill en masse.
Let me respond.
That's why we're using.
Let me respond.
So everybody who uses these words is complicit.
Ambassador,
everyone,
let me respond.
This, alongside the bombing of Yemen, is really not something new for me. Growing up as a British Muslim, the idea of terrorism being used to justify wars and violence in Muslim-majority countries and against Muslims living in countries like the UK, the US, etc., have become kind of part of daily life. And what we need to recognise is the role that the discourse around terrorism plays in not only day-to-day Islamophobia, but also in institutional racism. By labelling all Palestinians as being complicit in the actions of Hamas, they are all deemed as terrorists. And this is very much evident in the language of not only the Israeli government, but our government as well. They all become legitimate targets or basically collateral damage. And again, this isn't new to Palestine, it isn't new to Yemen. We've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this in Afghanistan, and we've seen this even before the war on terror. And really, you can't talk about Islamophobia without talking about the war on terror. I want to make clear also, by the way, that all Palestinians are not Muslim, and that this is not a Muslim issue. But what makes this an Islamophobia issue is the discourse around terrorism. I think because of the subject of Gaza and Islamophobia, etc., and the war on terror, I am talking about British army involvement in Muslim majority countries. But those aren't the only regions or countries where there is neocolonialism and British army involvement. I'm going to put a link into the description about neocolonialism in Kenya, and also putting links to donate to the Congo, where at the moment Western consumption of smart devices is fueling a genocide. And this is being so underrepresented and under-talked about that it is being described as a silent genocide, that it's kind of happening without anyone really noticing or caring. In fact, a man from the Congo set himself on fire to bring it to the world's attention, to try and bring it to the world's attention. Although sadly, I don't feel like the media here in the UK has picked up on it that much. So if you're speaking out against Israel and what they are doing to the Palestinians, then please also use your energy to post about what is happening in the DRC. Please also donate if you can, raise awareness, tell people what's going on. I'm putting links to donate in the description. Now, EastEnders has looked at Islamophobia. It's looked at it quite a bit. But I argue that it mostly looks at it on a private level. If it really wanted to interrogate Islamophobia, it would look at how the war on terror and how government debate and how government discourse and political discourse since 2001 especially has been driving the othering and the dehumanization of Muslims. I just find it bizarre also that this wasn't really discussed by the Masood family. Even when Shabnam was a victim of an Islamophobic hate crime, this was not brought up. Never is this brought up in any instance of Islamophobic hate crimes. Maybe this is why EastEnders has never had refugee characters, because then they would have to get into that. The most recently was the Aaron Monroe storyline, who was part of a far-right group. Aaron was a new character who was the brother and son of established characters Diana and Harvey. And he was shown to already be a part of a far-right group with very little explanation given apart from perhaps 2 minutes in the climax of the storyline, blaming it all on Harvey, about his motivations for joining this group and how he had come to form these opinions, rather than looking at the bigger picture and looking at how media and politics influence and form the far right, along with austerity and poverty. A sole focus was given on Aaron being bad and therefore being a part of this far right organisation. Now, don't get me wrong, being part of a far-right organisation is bad, but there are always reasonings behind it. There are motivations behind it, and if you fail to really interrogate that, then you don't really help to solve the issue. Without looking at how mainstream elements such as the media and politics play a role in that, and the army play a role in that, we fail to really get to the root of the issue. Now, as I've already said, you can't talk about Islamophobia without talking about the war on terror. When the Western world first came into contact with the other, it was mainly first the Arab world that they came across in the Middle East. And of course, Islam was the primary religion of the region. In the late 70s, Christian Palestinian academic Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, which summarized how the Western world constructed the Middle Eastern Muslim world through a very Western lens, and how through literature, paintings, politics, discourse, even science, during the rapid expansion of empire and colonial interests, all positioned the Middle Eastern other as inferior and backwards, including the religion of Islam, which was constructed as a backwards, primitive version of Christianity. In 2001, after the attacks on the Twin Towers, the war on terror became the primary focus of the US and the UK governments. And they decided, of course, that, despite Osama bin Laden being from Afghanistan and, of course, being trained in the UK and the US, that Iraq was, of course, the primary target for defeating terrorism, a country that, of course, the US and the UK had previously supported. Interesting how we decide who to bomb based on who we suddenly are and are not friends with. It's been established by many academics, including Stephen Vertigans, how the war on terror and the discourse of terrorism has been used to justify the restricting of civil liberties of mainly Muslim and Muslim adjacent, so South Asian, Arab, not just Muslims, become the target of Islamophobia. Many Sikhs have also been the victims of hate crimes as a result of being mistaken for being Muslim. And this ties into the othering of Muslims and their construction as a religious and cultural other, in which Sikhs, because of their cultural attire, can also be just meshed into and seen as one. Khalid A. Baidoun writes about how there are 3 different forms of Islamophobia: private, structural, and dialectical. Private is day-to-day Islamophobia, hate crimes, the way someone may treat you because you are Muslim and because of their beliefs about Muslims. There is then structural, which is essentially institutional racism, which comes in the form of, as I've just said, politicians, debate and rhetoric. I may be repeating myself here, but again, EastEnders always shows Islamophobia as being committed by random acts, by random people, or just by nasty people. It really fails to interrogate how people who may be against acts of violence against Muslims and hate crimes and, even name calling and all of that kind of stuff, still support acts of violence against Muslims through the army, if that makes sense, right? Because ultimately, our army has been complicit in that, in the war in Iraq. There have been war crimes committed by our government, by our army, and there have been cover-ups to those war crimes as well. There have been war crimes committed in Afghanistan with the bombing of civilians by drones, indiscriminate bombing in various Muslim majority countries, and all of this has been seen as just kind of necessary for the greater good.
This is what it's like on the receiving end. During a short lull, ambulance crews took to the streets to tend to civilian casualties. The let-up did not last long, however. More cruise missiles. 300 of these frightening weapons were aimed at Baghdad during the night.
To other news here this Friday night, the Pentagon now admitting the deadly drone strike in the last days of the U.S. withdrawal from Kabul was a, quote, tragic mistake. 10 civilians, including 7 children, killed in the blast.
Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination? What fools we are to live in a generation for which war is a computer game for our children and just an interesting little Channel 4 news item.
When Sean Slater came into EastEnders and revealed to Stacey that he'd been in the war, and Stacey's response is,
You've been in the thing? In Iraq?
Yeah, I've been in the thing.
There is no connection to what was happening out there. There is real distance she's putting between us as the viewers and even Sean as a soldier and what happened out there, really separating him as well from the violence that he would have been carrying out as a member of the British Army. This brings me back to the idea that EastEnders wants to position the army as a force for social good. I argue that this was something that specifically started in 2010 with the arrival of the new Conservative government. Previous characters who had joined the army included Grant Mitchell and Sean Slater, who I've already mentioned. And neither of these characters were particularly shown to be nice. In fact, Grant was shown to have developed his explosive anger due to his time serving in the army and specifically being a part of the Falklands War. Further to this, Sean Slater was also shown to have quite a temper on him and be incredibly violent. So I would say neither character particularly demonstrated time in the army as being a good thing for either of them. But then we come into 2010 and we have the reintroduction of Billy Jackson, the youngest son of the Jackson family. Billy was shown to be a part of a gang. There was all kinds of issues. Jack got shot and he decided to make Jack proud to join the army, to make something of himself. Whilst Carol initially objected to it, she eventually accepted that this would be the fresh start that he needed. Now, I've often heard the idea that the army would be good for him, or, you know, the army will sort him out. I came across this article by Victoria Basham, who discusses how in 2010 the Conservative government brought in something called the Military Ethos Initiative, where they recommended that teachers bring in troops to help deal with the teacher shortage in schools. That's right, rather than actually deal with their effects of austerity by pummeling money into the public school system, they thought, let's turn former soldiers into teachers and bring military discipline into schools. Of course, this wasn't compulsory, but this brought in a social idea that there was an issue with discipline within schools and within children that could be fixed by military style training. This is something that I think is not something that the Conservatives invented, but rather an old-fashioned ideology, and I think something that maybe compulsory military conscription stemmed from. As Victoria Basham discusses, this normalizes the violence that the army does on a daily basis against other countries and kind of epitomizes the army as a force for social good and an organization, an institution that can help reform people, reform characters, and help sort the problem of young working class boys especially. This is why I recorded this video before, but then I had to re-record it when I thought about it, and I thought about the context in which those episodes of Billy Jackson joining the army came about. Now, of course, I know some people say Carol showed objection. She gave reasons about, you're just going, she talked to an anti-war activist, and yes, she did. But it was shown as kind of like the desperate attempts of a mother who did not want to let go of her baby boy. It really wasn't seen as someone who had a solid reasoning to be objecting to what the army does. And if her reasoning had been that strong, then she really wouldn't have let Billy go. So I don't really see Carol's objections as anything strong. And if anything, because of her characterization as a nagging mother, it was kind of par for the course and something that we almost expected from her, rather than something that gave us an aha moment about what the army does. Billy had been part of a gang, and we've got to remember also that the government came in with austerity measures. So now there was the issue of how do we solve working class boys. And like I said, this didn't start with the Tories, this didn't start with austerity. I remember under New Labour, perhaps even before then, going around in my local hometown and seeing an army recruitment centre right near the Dole office, and that really, really annoys me. The recruitment of working class people is nothing new, and to me it makes me very angry, because to me, and this may upset a lot of people, but it's got to be said that they are being recruited as cannon fodder for the interests of few politicians and businessmen who want to keep up arms sales. I'm sorry, that's essentially what it is. It's very sad, because I know a lot of people who don't see any opportunities in the field that they want to pursue, and this is across a wide range of fields, but the only places where there are funded opportunities are in the army. Not in the NHS, not in, any company, anything. It's the army that will pay for it. Of course, this is a lot worse in the US, where free healthcare and university education is tied up with joining the military, and those are really basics. We've seen this throughout history, is the working class from World War I to even before then, the recruitment and the use of young working class people and their brainwashing into believing that they're doing something good and that this is good for their development. And that becomes especially codified when it's a young black teenager who has come out of a gang. I would argue that he's joining one gang to join another more violent, more organized gang, but it was framed as he's coming out of a gang, something that is codified as a black problem, and going into the army, which will resolve the issue and help his development into a model citizen and the kind of citizen we want in this country, right? Around this time, there was also a great deal of moral panic around gangs and around criminality in London, which was very racially coded, very racially charged, and racist. Let's say it was anti-black. A lot of the discourse about gangs in the UK at the time, and continuing to this day surrounding knife crime, is anti-black and provides misinformation about the actual statistics regarding knife crime, regarding gangs, regarding crime in this country. There was one particular line during that which really, really irritated me, when Carol said she would come to one of his leaving drinks, and she said, "It's a free country, isn't it?" And Billy said, "Yes, Mum, and some people are still fighting to keep it that way." Again, this framed the army as something heroic, an institution that is defending people's freedoms, when I have to really ask who was really coming for our freedoms in the way we came for the Iraqis' freedom, in the way we've come for the Yemenis' freedom, in the way we've taken it away by subjecting them to this humanitarian crisis, by selling our arms to Saudi Arabia, by selling our arms to Israel. It was our army and our government that created a political vacuum in Iraq that caused ISIS to form. Whose freedoms, Billy? Whose? And then further to this, we have Lee Carter, of course. His parents were so proud that he was a part of the army, and he was your boy next door, Jack the Lad, kind of guy. And the army was seen as the high point of his career. It was after he left the army that he was shown to really struggle. And following on from that, of course, we have Callum Highway, who is suffering from PTSD after saving some children, committing a very heroic act. It's funny how none of these soldiers, since 2010 we see, have PTSD from killing children. And coming out from this, since 2010, when we look at the army, it is always in these rosy terms, always in a positive sense. I don't see a lot in EastEnders, however, about the issues in the army, such as domestic violence. The number of people in the army who commit domestic violence, the number of people in the army who go on to become homeless, the number of incidents of sexual violence in the army. These are all things that are very prevalent and we know about, and yet there is no discussion of this in EastEnders. And I feel like if they really want to look at the army, let's take a real look. Let's look more deeply into the army. Let's not portray this as this organization and institution that's out to do good in the world when we know it's not, and that it won't help everyone. It's not going to solve the issue of working class boys. What will really solve that issue is putting money into public services. It's into ending austerity, which is essentially a political choice. It's to stopping neo-colonialism. So I know this has been quite a full-on episode, and thank you for watching it for those who have, and I appreciate it, and I look forward. Don't worry, I'm still going to be doing reaction videos. I'm going to be doing more videos like this, but I'm also going to be doing more reaction videos, more sketches. So all of that is still to come. There are links, like I said, resources for you to check out in the description. There are also links to donate, so please check them out. Thank you, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next episode.